They laughed at her every single day, calling her just the black girl janitor. But what they didn't know was that this young woman carried a secret so powerful it would flip their entire world upside down. The very next day she returned, not with a mop but with the keys to the company. What happened next will shock you, so subscribe for more stories like this. In every company, there are people who remain unseen. The ones who slip in before the sun rises, who clean up the mess others leave behind, and who disappear before anyone even bothers to notice their existence. In this story, that invisible figure was a young black girl named Janine. To the employees of the towering corporate building, she was nothing more than the janitor. Janine's mornings began when the city was still half asleep. She arrived with her cleaning cart, her gloves already worn from overuse, and her bucket of water sloshing quietly across the marble floors. Every day she polished the same silver handles, scrubbed the same coffee stains from glass tables, and wiped down the same fingerprints left behind by people who never once looked her in the eye. But while her work kept the company shining, her presence was met with cruelty. The sharpest of all came from Mr. Howard, the company's proud, arrogant boss. He was the kind of man who thrived on belittling others, whose laughter always filled the halls, not with joy but with mockery. And for Janine, his cruelty had no limit. He laughed at her uniform, sneered at her slow movements, and smirked at her as though she were beneath him. "Just the janitor," he would say, loud enough for the entire hallway to hear. And his employees followed his lead. They rolled their eyes when they saw her, giggled when she bent to scrub a floor, and treated her existence like a joke. To them, Janine wasn't a person. She was simply background noise in their lives. But behind her silence, Janine carried something they could never have imagined. Because while they saw only a girl pushing a mop, Janine knew a truth so powerful it could shatter their entire world. The walls of that company told a story no one else cared to see. Framed black and white photographs lined the hallways, capturing the proud faces of men who had founded the business decades earlier. They were relics to most, meaningless decorations gathering dust. But to Janine, they were family portraits. She could trace the sharp jawline of her grandfather in one frame, the determined gaze of her father in another. This company wasn't just where she worked. It was her blood, her family's legacy, stolen from them through betrayal and greed. And now, in the very place where her ancestors once stood tall, she was reduced to sweeping floors and scrubbing toilets. Still, Janine endured. She endured the insults, the stares, and the laughter, all while carrying her secret like a flame in her chest, because she knew something no one else knew. The empire that Howard bragged about was already cracking beneath his feet. Contracts were failing, clients were leaving, and investors were whispering about pulling out. She could see the desperation in their late-night meetings, hear the panic in the muffled voices that slipped through boardroom doors. And while they mocked her, Janine was patient. She waited silently for the moment the cracks would widen, for the moment their empire would crumble. That Friday afternoon, as Mr. Howard strutted through the office bragging about his latest deal, he still found time to laugh at Janine. "Even the janitor probably knows we're collapsing," he sneered. The room erupted with nervous laughter. They didn't know how right he was. That evening, when the lights dimmed and the office grew silent, Janine paused her mop strokes and looked up at the company's glowing logo in the lobby. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished marble beneath it. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a small smile, because tomorrow everything will change, and when she returned, she would not be carrying a mop, she would be carrying the truth, and the keys to an empire that no insult could ever take away from her again. When the weekend began, the office was quieter than usual, but tension lingered like smoke. The company's numbers were slipping, and though the executives tried to mask their fear with fake confidence, panic was growing in every corner of the building. Employees whispered in the hallways, rumors spread like wildfire, and everyone could feel the ground shifting beneath them. But none of that stopped Mr. Howard. He strutted through the office as though he were invincible, as though the collapse that loomed over his empire was nothing but a passing storm. He bragged loudly about big investors he claimed were waiting to sign contracts, about new opportunities he swore would make the company stronger than ever. The more things fell apart, the more he laughed, and still he never missed his favorite part of the day, mocking Janine. That Friday, as the board members argued behind closed doors and employees sat frozen at their desks, Howard spotted her cleaning near the glass doors. With his usual smirk, he said something cruel and sharp. The room filled with uncomfortable laughter, not because anyone found it funny, but because they were too afraid to disagree with their boss. Janine, as always, stayed quiet. She lowered her gaze, kept scrubbing the floor, and gave no reaction. But inside, she could feel the weight of destiny pressing closer. Howard believed he was untouchable. But by Monday, the world would see how wrong he was. That weekend, the company's problems hit their peak. The big investors Howard bragged about pulling out at the last moment. Longtime clients decided to end contracts, and the boardroom, once filled with blind loyalty, began to turn against him. Years of arrogance and poor leadership had finally caught up with Howard. But there was something even more devastating he didn't know. Someone was watching everything unfold from the shadows. Someone who carried the power to bring the final blow. That someone was Janine. For months she had prepared in silence. She gathered documents, tracked the company's failures, and studied the contracts her family had once signed. Her grandfather had built this empire from the ground up, only to be cheated out of it. Now, as the company teetered on the edge of destruction, Janine knew it was time to reclaim what was hers. On Monday morning, the office buzzed with chaos. Employees shuffled nervously, the board members gathered in emergency meetings, and Howard tried desperately to maintain his usual arrogant grin. But even his laughter was fading now. The weight of failure pressed hard against him, and for the first time, cracks began to show in his confidence, and that was the day Janine decided to reveal her secret. She arrived not in her usual uniform, but in a sharp, tailored suit. She didn't push a mop bucket or carry gloves. Instead, she walked straight through the lobby with papers in hand, legal documents that carried the truth of her family's legacy. The security guard, confused but respectful, opened the door for her. Employees stopped in shock as they realized who she was. No one laughed. No one sneered. That morning, the black girl janitor they had mocked for years walked into the boardroom and placed the truth on the table. The truth is that she was no ordinary janitor. The truth is that her grandfather's name was written into the company's very foundation. The truth that the empire Howard claimed as his was never truly his to begin with. And as the board read those documents, silence fell across the room. Howard tried to protest, but his voice cracked. The arrogance that once shielded him was gone, because the papers didn't lie. The company was collapsing, and now its rightful owner had returned to take her place. For Janine, it wasn't revenge. It was justice, the kind of justice her family had been denied for far too long. And as she looked around the room, the same room where she had once been invisible, she knew this was only the beginning. The boardroom had never been so silent. For years, it had been a stage where Howard's voice dominated every discussion, where laughter echoed at his jokes, and where his arrogance filled the air like smoke. But on that morning, no one dared to laugh. No one even dared to breathe too loudly, because the young black girl they had mocked for so long, the janitor they had dismissed as invisible, was standing at the head of the table, holding the future of the company in her hands. Janine laid the documents out one by one. Historical contracts, ownership records, handwritten notes from her grandfather, the original founder of the company. And alongside those papers, the legal agreements that proved the betrayal her family had suffered. Years ago, her grandfather had been forced out, stripped of his share through manipulation and deceit, leaving the empire in the hands of opportunists who never cared about its roots. For decades, that truth had been buried under layers of lies and polished boardroom speeches. But Janine had spent years quietly digging, gathering every piece of evidence, until the picture became undeniable. The executives leaned forward, reading in shock. Some turned pale, others covered their mouths with trembling hands. They had thought they knew the story of their company. But in that moment, They realized they had been living inside a lie. And at the center of that lie stood Howard. His face reddened with anger and fear, his hands clenched tightly on the table. He tried to speak, tried to shout, but his words stumbled and collapsed under the weight of the truth. The arrogance that once fueled him now betrayed him, making his voice sound weak and desperate. For Janine, this was not about humiliating him. It was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming the dignity her family had lost. She had endured years of silence, of scrubbing floors and swallowing insults, because she knew this moment would come. She knew that someday the world would see her for who she truly was, not just the janitor, but the rightful heir to an empire. The board members began whispering among themselves. They weren't fools. They could see the writing on the wall. Howard's leadership had already led them into disaster. Their contracts were falling apart, and now the truth of the company's history had come to light. Aligning with Howard meant sinking further into chaos. Aligning with Janine meant survival, and perhaps redemption. As the whispers grew louder, Howard slammed his fist on the table, desperate to maintain control. But his desperation only made the decision easier for those around him. They were tired of his arrogance, tired of his failures, and tired of watching the company crumble under his ego. Janine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her presence was enough. For the first time, people looked at her not with mockery, but with respect, some even with guilt, remembering the times they had laughed at her as she scrubbed their coffee spills and emptied their trash. Now, the balance of power has shifted. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. Howard's reign was over. The board would support Janine's claim, and legal action would follow to formalize what was already inevitable. When Janine walked out of the boardroom that day, the entire office watched in stunned silence. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Others stared with wide disbelief. The girl they had mocked for being invisible had just become the most visible person in the entire building. And as she walked past the lobby, the glowing company logo reflected on the polished floor. This time, her reflection wasn't that of a janitor, it was that of an owner. But Janine knew her journey wasn't finished yet. Owning the company was one thing. Restoring her family's honor, rebuilding the empire with integrity, and proving herself in a world that doubted her every step. That was the true challenge ahead. And she was ready. When Janine returned to the office the next day, the atmosphere was different. Gone were the snickers and whispers that usually followed her footsteps. No one laughed as she walked through the lobby. No one rolled their eyes as she passed. The same employees who once treated her like she didn't exist now turned their heads insolence. Their faces painted with uncertainty and guilt. She wore no uniform this time. No gloves, no mop, no cleaning cart. Instead, she carried herself with quiet authority, dressed in elegance, her hair tied neatly, her shoulders straight. She didn't need to announce the change. Everyone could see it. The woman who once bent over floors was now walking through the doors as their new leader. Howard, however, hadn't given up. His pride was too thick, his arrogance too ingrained. He still believed he could fight back, still believed the office was his stage. He strutted into the building that morning with his usual forced smirk, though the cracks in his mask were clear. His voice was louder than ever, desperate to remind everyone of his power. But his words rang hollow, because power is not in the volume of your voice. It's in the weight of truth, and the truth now belonged to Janine. The boardroom made it official. The documents were verified, the signatures reviewed, and the legacy restored. The company was legally hers. What Howard had stolen through manipulation was undone through persistence and patience. The empire he once claimed as his own was back in the hands of its rightful heir, the black girl he had mocked every single day. Janine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She sat in the very chair Howard had once occupied, and with calm authority, she outlined the company's new direction. Her vision wasn't about revenge, it was about rebuilding. She spoke about integrity, about respect, about valuing the people who had been overlooked for too long. And though her voice was soft, it carried more weight than all of Howard's arrogance combined. The employees listened in stunned silence. Some nodded, some lowered their eyes, remembering the times they had laughed at her. For the first time, they saw her not as the janitor they ignored, but as the leader they needed. Howard, unable to bear the humiliation, tried to interrupt. He shouted, slammed his hand on the table, and accused her of lies. But the louder he became, the smaller he looked. His desperation only confirmed his downfall. The board members, once his loyal allies, turned away from him. Their eyes were fixed on Janine, and that was her revenge. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't have to humiliate him in return. Her mere presence, her quiet dignity, her undeniable truth, that was enough to destroy him. The man who had laughed at her for years now sat red-faced, powerless, watching the very company slip from his grasp. In the days that followed, Howard was removed from his position. His name, once plastered across every success, faded quickly from memory. Employees who had once mimicked his cruelty now avoided his gaze. He became a shadow in the very place he once ruled. Meanwhile, Janine transformed the office. She didn't just claim her place at the top, she changed the culture entirely. The cleaners, the assistants, the interns, those who had always been invisible, were now treated with the respect they deserved. She remembered every insult, every humiliation, every smirk directed at her, and she made sure no one else would ever have to endure the same. This was justice. Quiet, graceful, undeniable justice, and though she never said it aloud, her actions spoke louder than words. The janitor you laughed at is now the boss you answer to. Howard's fall was complete, but Janine's journey had only just begun. Because while she had claimed the company, she still had to prove to the world that she could lead it, and that her family's legacy would rise stronger than ever before. With Howard gone and the truth revealed, Janine stood at the helm of the company her father once dreamed of. But inheriting a legacy was one thing, rebuilding it was another. The weight of expectation hung heavy on her shoulders. Some doubted her, whispering that she was only lucky, that she had stumbled into power she could never manage. Janine heard the whispers, but she didn't let them define her. She had survived far worse, the ridicule, the laughter, the years of being invisible. If she could endure all of that, she could certainly face this new challenge. She had not fought to take the company just for revenge. She had done it to restore dignity, to honor her father's name, and to give people who were overlooked the chance they deserved. Her first act as CEO was symbolic yet powerful. She called together the janitors, the security guards, the cafeteria workers, the very people who kept the company running but were treated as shadows. They stood nervously in the boardroom, unsure why they had been summoned. And then, in front of every executive and department head, Janine thanked them. She spoke about how their work mattered, how respect should not be reserved only for titles and suits, but for every single person who gave their time and energy to the company. For the first time, those who had been ignored felt seen. Some cried quietly. Others smiled through disbelief. The entire office watched as Janine shattered the culture of arrogance Howard had built. The message was clear. In her company, no one would ever be treated as just anything. But Janine knew respect alone wouldn't save the company. The business had been bleeding under Howard's reckless leadership. Clients had left, projects had collapsed, and trust was gone. If she didn't act fast, the empire would crumble. So she worked. Long nights at her desk, reviewing contracts, reaching out to old partners, rebuilding bridges Howard had burned. She brought back employees who had been forced out for refusing to compromise their ethics. She welcomed fresh talent with new ideas. And slowly, the tide began to turn. Her vision wasn't about chasing profits at any cost. It was about building something that lasted. She wanted innovation, but also integrity. Growth, but also humanity. And people responded to that vision. Clients who had abandoned the company began to return. Investors who had hesitated started to trust again. What shocked many was how quickly the atmosphere in the office shifted. Laughter no longer came at the expense of others. It came from collaboration, from genuine teamwork. The same desks that once echoed with gossip now buzzed with new energy. Employees who had once mocked Janine now worked with pride under her leadership. Howard, watching from the outside, seethed with bitterness. He had believed the company would collapse without him. Instead, he was forced to watch as it flourished in Janine's hands. And though he still clung to his arrogance, deep down, he knew the truth. He had been replaced, not just by a leader, but by a force greater than himself. Janine wasn't just rebuilding the company, she was rewriting its story. The world began to notice. Articles praised the new CEO, who had risen from janitor to owner, calling it one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in years. Social media lit up with her story, people from all walks of life inspired by the woman who had endured mockery only to rise higher than anyone imagined. And through it all, Janine never forgot the pain that had brought her here. She used it as fuel, as a reminder that strength is born not from privilege, but from persistence. Her father's legacy was alive again. But this time, it wasn't just his dream, it was hers too. Yet even as she rebuilt the company, she knew her greatest test was still to come, because Howard wasn't finished. And power, once lost, rarely leaves quietly. Howard was not the type of man to fade quietly into the background. Losing the company he had controlled for years was a blow his ego could not accept. And so, in one final desperate act, he tried to claw back what he had lost. He hired lawyers, spread lies, and even attempted to convince investors that Janine was unfit to lead. For a moment, whispers filled the air again. Could Janine really handle the storm? Could she survive Howard's last strike? But unlike before, Janine wasn't standing alone. The very people Howard had dismissed now stood by her side. Employees who once laughed at her now defended her. Clients who once doubted her now trusted her. Even the janitors, the assistants, the ones Howard ignored, became her fiercest supporters. The strength of a leader isn't measured by how loudly they command. It's measured by how deeply people believe in them. And Janine had earned that belief. When the final court ruling came, the truth could no longer be denied. Howard's claims were thrown out. His lies collapsed under the weight of evidence. The company was declared rightfully hers, beyond dispute. The moment was poetic. The man who had mocked a black girl for scrubbing floors was now stripped of every ounce of power he once wielded. His empire was gone, his influence destroyed, not by anger, not by revenge, but by the quiet, steady rise of the woman he had underestimated. Howard left the courtroom that day with no cameras following him, no supporters cheering him on. Just silence. The world that once bowed to him now looked the other way. But Janine's story did not end with his fall. Her victory was never about him. It was about rewriting a culture, about showing the world that strength can rise from the shadows, that dignity can outlast mockery, and that justice, though slow, always arrives. Under her leadership, the company flourished. It became known not just for its profits, but for its values. Workers at every level were respected, voices that had been ignored were finally heard, and innovation thrived in the environment she had built. Janine had transformed pain into purpose. She had taken the cruelty that once tried to break her and turned it into the foundation of something greater. And in doing so, she became a symbol, not just within the company, but beyond it. Articles called her the CEO who rose from the janitor's closet. Students studied her turnaround as a case of resilience and leadership. Young black women looked at her story and saw themselves, saw proof that they, too, could rise above mockery, above doubt, above the barriers placed before them. Her father's dream was alive again, stronger than ever. And now it carried not just his legacy, but hers. And so the story ended where it began, in that same building where laughter once echoed through the halls. But now, when Janine walked through those doors, there were no smirks, no cruel whispers. There was only respect. The janitor they once laughed at was now the leader they followed, and the world would never forget it. She walked in as a janitor and left as the boss, and that's proof that no matter how much they laugh at you today, tomorrow might just be the day you own the room. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because more powerful stories like this are on the way.